Welcome to a special edition of the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm your host, Mike Goodpaster, and today we are going to talk a little boxing, which is my favorite thing to do, especially when it's a little bit older boxing. And I always have this guy on when I want to talk older boxing because he's old. And he wrote a book, Blood on My Notebook. I want to welcome to the show John J.Raspanti. How you doing, John?
I'm doing great, Mike. Thank you for reminding me that I'm old. Thank you.
Well, you're older than me. That's why I like to do that, because most of the time, everybody that I have on is younger than me, unless I'm doing a legend show. Now, you've had some experience writing a book before. You wrote with Dennis Taylor, The Tale of Gotti and Ward. What brought you to want to write Blood on My Notebook?
Well, it was kind of a dream. I didn't want to, and this might sound funny to some people, or maybe some people will understand, but I didn't want to just think of myself as doing one book. I wanted to do another book that was just exclusively my writing, my journey through boxing, my history, and give a little background in the beginning, how it all happened, and then take the readers through what I consider, and have been told this, it's hard for anybody who writes, I think, to judge how good their stuff is, but what I've been told is my best stuff, and then do it in a chronological way where when I started the first fight I ever covered, and then just work my way through the last 10 years and do that. And it was always a dream, and this whole thing, Mike, this whole journey that I've been on, anybody who knows me knows it's a dream. It's probably why I have always related to our favorite movie, Rocky, because, that line above the poster that I love, his whole life was 1,000,000 to 1 shot. I kind of thought of that in a way with me because I was never what you would call a school guy at all. I was only there in school for 2 reasons, and not necessarily in this order: sports and girls. And I did not care about studying, so I did not have a degree or any kind of a degree when I started to write. It was just something that I liked or loved. So I've always kind of considered myself, in a sense, an underdog, and that's also why I like boxers so much, because they start their journey with a dream, and they have a lot of people that tell them, you're wasting your time, you can't do this. And I had that. I was 50 years old. I had people saying, what are you doing, wasting your time doing that? Stick to what you know, which was computers, which I hated. So I just got very determined that I wanted to write something, and then and I started to write for Doghouse Boxing, like I say in the beginning, and then Max Boxing. But I really wanted to just put a book together, like I said, of what hopefully is the best work that I've been able to do the last 10 years, and hope that the readers will enjoy reading the stories and understand how I did it.
Now, what drew you to the boxing? I know that you also loved baseball and football, but why was boxing the sport you wanted to write about? What was the love affair with boxing?
Well, like you, when I was a kid, I loved basketball. That was my favorite sport, and I loved boxing too. But when I got older, basketball changed some, and boxing has changed too. But boxing has always had these intriguing characters that I've always liked. And then what started my run, my whole love was my family. My grandfather, my uncles, my dad, of course, more than anybody. Coming from Chicago, all the boxing stories I heard, all the times my dad saw people, his eyes would light up when he'd say, this time I was in this bar in Chicago when I was 18, and in walks Ike Williams, who people that know boxing history remember well, one of the best fighters to come along in that era. And then he loved Johnny Bratton. He would tell me about seeing Johnny Bratton driving around in his convertible, waving at all the kids. And it just did something to me, probably because of just the whole individualistic nature of the sport. And then the people that loved it seemed to be immigrants, poor people, and being an Italian, the pride that people got. My dad obviously loved a lot of Italians, but of course fighters. But of course, his favorite was Joe Louis. So he was all over. But he cheered for Rocky Graziano. He cheered for Jake LaMotta. He cheered for those guys. But I think it was really his love of the sport that really got me interested in it. And then I couldn't help it. I just have always been somebody that if somebody's really interested, they get me interested, I have to pursue it. And that's really how it started. My dad and I would just talk about fights that he saw. You know, he when he was not even 10, he witnessed Joe Louis winning the heavyweight title in Chicago. So it's just got something of a mythical lore to it, to me, that just drew me. And then there's so much drama in boxing, so much personal history, so many interesting things going on that for me, I can't see how anybody, forgetting what's going on in the fight, which is always interesting too, but outside of the ring, how people can't be fascinated by these people that are willing to put it on the line like they do for us, and fight. And it's always been just a fascinating subject for me and always my favorite.
Yeah, and I had the same experience with my dad, and I remember my dad used to tell me about Ali against Carl Mildenberger, because my dad was actually stationed in Germany during that time. And then I remember him putting me to bed with stories about Nick Wells, this big, almost mythical guy, when you heard my dad talk about him. And the cool thing about it was getting to interview Larry Holmes and getting to talk to him about Nick Wells. And he's like, your dad was right. Nick Wells was a bad SOB. And, I mean, but Nick Wells, it didn't work out. And it seems like in boxing, more often than not, you have guys with a ton of talent that come up short, whether it's in their own head, whether they are just in with the wrong crowd that is helping to take care of them. I mean, I know you had an article about Darnell Boone in here, and Darnell Boone is a guy that when you look at his record, you see all the losses, and you think, well, he wasn't very good. But he was one of the guys circumstantially with no trainer or manager for a lot of his career, and he was basically taken advantage of. But it was a guy with a ton of talent that beat a lot of good fighters, but people don't really know about him. And I think that's why it makes it so great that in this book you've got a section on Darnell Boone.
Yeah, Darnell Boone is one of the best people in boxing that I've met, and I've not personally, but we've communicated. And that's the thing about Darnell, and that was why I always supported him. Was I just wanted to see him get his shot. I mean, he knocked out Stevenson, Adonis Stevenson, before Stevenson was the light heavyweight champion. He had Andre Ward in a world of hurt. When he had Sergey Kovalev in a world of hurt. Some people thought he won the fight when they thought it was a draw. When he got a chance to get himself ready, he was a tough out. A lot of people didn't want to fight him. He took away a lot of O's from some unbeaten guys that thought he was just some has-been with a 500 record that couldn't fight. And they found out very quickly that even when Darnell wasn't totally motivated, he was as tough as nails and he could fight. And those are the kind of guys that I always like to remind people about, because they are the, whatever you want to call them, a journeyman, a gatekeeper. But in Darnell's case, he's got some real boxing ability, and he doesn't really have much bitterness about it. We speak not as often as I would like to, but we still do, and he's moved on from it. He's still fighting, getting close to 40, but he's still fighting. And he seems to have he raps and he's just a very interesting guy. But his boxing career was such a Jekyll and Hyde thing, because he beat an undefeated guy and then he'd fight another guy and he'd either lose they gave me 4 days to get ready, and I'm like, Darnell, why did you take the fight? Well, I like to eat, and that. For me, I can't help but admire that in a person, that they're willing to sacrifice themselves for what they're doing and provide for their family. And it's just too bad that he never got signed by somebody who really would have trained him properly, handled him properly. Maybe he wouldn't have made it to the top. He would have been but I think he would have done better, just because they would have taken better care of him. And he just impulsively took fights sometimes that weren't really the best things for him to do, like I said, because he wanted to eat. So I couldn't I couldn't blame him. And then when he'd have people with him, they took advantage of him, like you said. And he had a best friend in his corner for one fight. I remember he told me where the guy didn't know really anything about boxing, just was a basic guy, and he had him in there with him. His other trainer left him or something, and something was going on, and it was just like, my gosh. And this is what I mean, the stories that these guys do in their lives. It's just incredible, and I couldn't help it. I had to include Darnell in the book.
Yeah, and another one before we get too far, Randy Shields. And I know you set me up with an interview with Randy, who's a great guy.
Yep.
He wrote the foreword to your book. I mean, the thing is this.
Yes.
Would you have ever thought 15 years ago that Randy Shields would write a foreword for a John Raspanti book?
Oh, absolutely not, Mike. I'll tell you real story. It just happened recently, and it ties in exactly what you're saying. Right after the book got released, I was sitting here like I am right now, and within a 45-minute span, Randy Shields called me, Carlos Palomino called me, and Armando Muniz called me. And I just shook my head like you talk when you're talking to Larry Holmes about Nick Wells. I mean, I literally had to pinch myself. Like, I saw all these guys fight, and now here it is all these years later, and I'm friends with them. And yeah, Randy is another one that's just he is so honest about things. It just blows my mind. He's just like a left hook to the gut. He'll tell you straight out what it is, and no bullshit from Randy. That's just Randy. And when I asked him to do the forward for this book, because in all transparency, we are friends and good friends. He said, "Oh yeah, I'd like to, and I'd love to do it for you." And he did it. And you can see it's not very long, but that doesn't matter. That's very representative of Randy. And yeah, you hit the core of the book. It's just that so many of things that have happened of these people that I watched as a young guy, and now are part of my life as friends. Is just incredible to me. I still shake my head and go, "Can you believe this?" And sometimes I go, "No, I can't believe it."
Yeah, it's amazing sometimes. And the one that sticks out to me was when we both got to interview George Foreman.
Yes.
I mean, that was a time where I'm sitting here the entire time, and I have got to interview a lot of guys at a lot of sports that, I watched them growing up. But the George Foreman thing is the one where it kind of went back to my dad again. And the entire time I'm doing it, I'm just sitting here thinking, man, I wish my dad could hear this. I wish my dad knew that I was talking to Big George Foreman.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. My dad died 6 years ago, and luckily for me, I had become friends with a number of these guys, and he would be just as wowed. But since then, there have been other people that I've discussed, and I think the same thing, how much I would have loved to have just called him and say, "Hey, Dad, guess who I just talked to?" And
yeah.
Who? And the same with my grandfather. My grandfather lived in the L.A. area, and I talk about this in my introduction, and he followed all the fighters in the 60s and 70s. He was only 20 minutes or so from the Olympics, so he read all about Mondo Ramos and Jerry Quarry and all those guys that fought at the Olympics, Carlos and Armando and Zovic Barajas and Turi the Fury Pineda and Danny Lopez, Bobby Chacon. I mean, he was fans of all those guys, and when we would talk on the phone, he was about my age. I'm about his age now that he was when he was, and he would get so excited, probably like I am right now, talking about those guys, how much he liked them. And he really liked Danny Little Red Lopez. And that was another moment when I went to the a Boxing Hall of Fame event, and there was Danny Little Red Lopez. And I thought to myself, oh, my God, if my grandfather, if he could be here right now, I just wish he was. And I said that to Danny's beautiful wife, Bonnie, who's such a sweet lady. I said, do you mind if I get a picture with the champ? I said, I just wish so badly my grandfather was here. And obviously I really admire Danny. And she goes, of course. And so I walked over there, and it's a cherished memory. I mean, when I ended up writing about the event, I focused really on Danny, because when he comes into the room, people just kind of stop and look at him. Same thing with Bobby Chacon. When Bobby was with us, he was so loved by so many people and more than respected. And he didn't take any of it seriously, and neither does Danny. But yeah, that connection with other generations, I think, is what really makes boxing so universal. You know, when you can talk to somebody who saw something 40 years before you were even around, perhaps, and then relate it to your life. It's incredible. Just incredible.
Yeah, and you bring up Bobby Chacon, which was one of both of our favorites. Growing up, I loved watching Bobby Chacon. And you got to have coffee with him, and you write about it in your book also. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was also one of those surreal moments. I was in Los Angeles to cover the fights, and I had got lucky enough to get to be friends with Mike Donahue, who's also just a fantastic human being. And Mike was taking care of Bobby at that point, and I asked if I could I'd like to speak with him, do an interview, and Mike said absolutely. And we met over by Staples Center in Los Angeles, and that's literally what it was, coffee with the champion. And I had some questions, but I just went off my script, and I just talked to Danny, and he was very impish. You know, he was jumping up, and he was hugging the waitress, but then his life was so dark in so many ways, and we talk about that, and his answers that you'll see when you read the book are just the kind where you just go, wow. You know, we think of the guy in the ring. We remember his wars. We admire his moxie, his guts, his skills. But his life outside of the ring was tumultuous, to say the least. And we delve into that. And it was hard to understand him in some respects, obviously, because of boxing and other things. But it didn't matter. He knew exactly what he was saying, and he talks about it. I could see it in his face. It was very emotional. We spent about 90 minutes together, and some of the pictures that I got from that day, he hugged me, and it was just funny. He was like that, and it was just something that I think about when I went back there. A few years after, I went over to that spot and kind of looked at where we were sitting, you know, because it was just something that I'll never forget. And hopefully I did a good job with the article. It was a hard one to write because of the life that was so up and then so down of Bobby Chacon. And then when you're alive, when you're seeing it and happening, and you remember his fights and then everything else that happened, it was a tough one, Mike. It was an emotional roller coaster to write it.
Yeah, and when you look at boxing, I think that's what separates the other sports, because the other day I saw somebody post about how, you know, out of the highest 10 paid athletes over the last decade, almost all of them are boxers. But I think what people forget is most guys are not making anywhere near that kind of money, and even the greats a lot of times end up going out the same way they came into the world, which was poor. And the guy that really stuck out there was the unmarked grave of Matthew Saad Muhammad.
Yeah, that's another one that I wrote from the heart, and it's included in the book. And Matthew was another favorite of mine. I love the man. I admired him. His fights with Marvin Johnson they were beyond wars. I mean, they were grueling. They were wars of attrition, is the way I would say it. And Matthew Saad Muhammad, from everything I ever read, one of the nicest people that ever walked on the earth. Yeah, he went from rags to riches to rags, and to being homeless, and again, it's the tragedy of boxing. In a weird way, it's part of the appeal, because these guys are so human again, and you relate. They're just human beings, and they reach these heights, and they trust, and the people that they have around them are not trustworthy people. And and I've met a number of them too, and it's pretty obvious, but they need somebody like a good friend who won't screw them. But money is the root of all evil, as we know, and that's kind of what happens. And that's another one that I wrote about with Matthew Saad Muhammad. I had to write about it, and the good thing about it is that he did end up getting a tombstone for his gravesite, a marker, I should say, and I wasn't responsible for it, but maybe I helped a little. But I did get something from a group that was supportive of that, and they thanked me for my article. But writing about Matthew and his ups and downs, again, was from the heart, and that's basically what I tried to do with a number of these. Is just write them from the heart, so people will understand what these guys went through, the sacrifices they made, and then how it doesn't always end up good. It doesn't end. You're right. A lot of times with boxers, most of the time, it doesn't end up good, and that makes it where we all just groan and go, oh. And
but see, I think that's
Muhammad,
what makes a boxer so relatable to a normal person. Because with normal people, it usually doesn't turn out like it does for a guy that just got a $150 million contract to throw a baseball for 4 years.
Exactly, and that maybe that's part of the appeal of the boxer, and they don't have. Some of them are lucky enough where they're good. They compete in the amateurs and they make a name for themselves, and they come out like Sugar Ray Leonard and they sign a big contract, and they've immediately got money. And Sugar Ray was an incredible fighter. I'm not putting him down at all. He was don't anybody think that. He was fantastic. He earned everything he made. So the other guys, though, that nobody really knows, that he's kind of a sea fighter, and he's fighting for $500, and he's doing it because he loves it, and then he starts to build a name, and those are the incredible stories, and that happens in boxing quite a bit, and I love that when that happens. It's kind of like the undrafted guy who walks out on the field, and before you know it, he ends up at some point in his life making it into the NFL or the NBA or
it's the Kurt Warner story. The guy who goes from bagging groceries to playing arena football to winning a Super Bowl, and then eventually the Hall of Fame.
Yes, exactly. And if you don't like those kind of stories, you don't have a heart, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you could dislike the player or whatever, but those are the most incredible American-type stories of somebody who's living a dream and not even living it. And then, boom, because of their talent, they rise. And I love that. And you see that in boxing. And you see guys improve. And you see them when they have their first fight. Then you see them when they have their 10th fight and you go, wow.
I think the stories like Kurt Warner is not that he had this talent. And I think for the most part, guys that succeed, there's a lot of people. Everybody has talent. But very few people are willing to put in the work and sacrifice to bring the talent to fruition.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And that's what happens in boxing, too. If you got guys who have talent, but if they don't work hard and sacrifice, they're not gonna make it. I have a number of stories in my book about Andre Ward, and he was one of the hardest workers I ever saw. And obviously, he had talent. Everybody knew that, but he didn't take any of his talent for granted. I watched that man work. I watched him spar. I watched how he grinded, how he fought through injuries. You could like him or dislike him as a fighter, but as somebody who had a determination to succeed, you have to admire that, and that's what you see in a number of these people.
All right, the next guy that I'd really like to talk about is Armando Muniz, because he's a guy that when I got to interview him, I was all excited, and I tell people I'm interviewing Armando, and who's that? Who's that? I'm like, come on, you don't know who Armando Muniz is? And Armando is a great story because he's a guy that basically got screwed out of being a world champion. But he's not bitter about it. He's just a great man in general.
He sure is. And when in the book, I have something that's never been posted anywhere. I barely even read it myself. And what happened was, Mike, real fast, is I contacted Armando over 10 years ago through email. I was working my job then, and I found him at a Riverside high school, and he was teaching Spanish, and he was also the wrestling coach, I believe. And I found his email address, and I talk about this in my article, and I just sent him an email, and basically I said, "Hi, is this the Armando Muniz?" And he said, yeah, it is. And I'm like, oh my God, it is really, it's really Armando Muniz. And I got all excited, and he was just flabbergasted that I was all excited about emailing him. And that's how it started. So what happened was I ended up going out to Los Angeles and meeting him and his family. And then I came home and I just wrote about it. And it's a marathon article. I'll say anybody that makes it through it, I'm impressed, because it's 14, 15 pages long, but it's everything that happened that day. And I call it Ring of Dreams, because that's what it was. Anybody who understands, like you're talking about, Mike, is anybody who idolizes anyone. And I idolized Armando. I had Armando and Muhammad Ali, two of the biggest opposites of fighters you could have, but I idolized them as a kid. Armando for totally different reasons, obviously, because he was almost always the underdog when it came to fighting for the title. And then the fact that, like you mentioned, that he got screwed. And so every time I talk to him, and not just me, people call him the uncrowned champion, and everybody knows it's true. Anybody, you showed on The Grueling Truth the film of Armando's fight with Napoles, the first one, the one that he got screwed over, and I think anybody who watched that could see what happened, that there was no way that Armando was going to leave that ring with the title. And we get into that, and Armando gives some inside information about that fight that I had never heard, and other fights that he had with Angel La Espada, things that happened in Puerto Rico that weren't exactly on the up and up, background information on his life. And I mean, he's a talkative guy anyway, but I was just wowed. I mean, we cracked a beer, we had a beer together, and it just was an incredible. I met his son and his wife, who's just a sweet lady, and writing about it was fantastic. And then Armando, it's true that Armando did read it years and years ago, and I never did post it, like I said, and he loved it, but he was so touched. When I told Armando a week or two ago that, or longer than that now, 3 weeks, that this particular article was included in this book, he was just wowed. That's the kind of man he is. He wasn't like thinking like, oh, well, it should be or something. He's not like that at all. Armando, very modest person, very nice person. He just couldn't believe it that I had put him in my book, and that tells you a lot about him. And that one, that one was I really wanted to include. That's really what got the ball rolling, Mike, was because I was trying to figure out a way to get that story out there, because I don't want anyone to ever forget Armando. It's like when you were just saying, Armando, you're excited, sure, but other people are like, who? I don't want anybody ever to forget it, because he truly is the uncrowned champion, and not just as a fighter, as a person.
Yeah, and that's even more important. Now, another one, and this one struck me when I was reading it, and actually I interviewed Mike Weaver, and he told me the same thing, but they were talking about money and how $75,000 was offered during the fight Holmes. They ended up giving him $50,000, and he told Don King, I'd take $50 to fight Larry Holmes. That is not the world we live in anymore, where we got guys arguing about whether they were offered $12 million or $50 million. And the difference here is it meant something for Mike Weaver to fight for the championship. And it meant something for all these guys in your book to be great. And that's whether it was Darnell Boone or Sugar Ray Leonard or Muhammad Ali. The idea was to be great, to be legendary, to never be forgotten. And I think we missed that today.
Oh, absolutely. The times are so different now, and the priorities of what it is to be great, what you fight for, is so different now. Obviously, when you're a fighter, you're a prize fighter, so you want to make money. But Mike Weaver is another guy, Mike, that just, an amazing person to meet, always smiling, remembers you, kind, and he went through hell in his career. He's another one, and you're right. He would fight anybody, and he did. He fought everybody in his time, and all the heavyweights. Larry Holmes, and the way he would talk about Larry Holmes, oh my God, Larry Holmes was such a great fighter, and that was the 1970s and 80s, and it's not really that long ago, but it seems like an eternity to me, just because the way the sports world in a lot of ways has been flipped upside down, where everything is so different as far as that goes. World titles, it was such a cool thing to say, this guy is the world title champion. This guy's the world heavyweight champion of the world. Now it's like, he's just one of the 4 or 5. And it's diminished everything as far as I'm concerned, and all these alphabet titles and everything. That's just my opinion. But But you're right, and I completely agree that the differences of those guys, the way they felt about winning a title, being great, fighting all the, it was all very sincere, and that's what they wanted. They weren't thinking about the money. Obviously, they were thinking about fighting the best fighters and living their dream, which was to be a champion, and that was how it was. It's not like some guys are that way now, but back then that was pretty much how everybody was.
Yeah, it was like Leon Spinks is not in good shape, and his wife, sent out a thing asking for prayers, and I find a guy on social media, because there's always that guy, who's talking crap about Leon Spinks. And my response to him was, and he was a Deontay Wilder fan, and my response to him is, you know what? Deontay Wilder has never been what Leon Spinks was. He was the heavyweight champion of the world. He won a 1976 Olympic gold medal. And from everything I've read about Leon Spinks, there's a lot of guys that think he was the greatest amateur heavyweight or light heavyweight that they ever saw.
Yeah.
I think he was a heavyweight there. But, yeah, all these guys talk about it. No, he won the light heavyweight title, didn't he?
Yeah.
Light heavy or super middleweight, something like that. Yeah, but I just don't think people really understand the magnitude of what it meant to be the world champion. And do we even have any right now? We got one or two guys maybe that are really the champion in their division. And then we've got heavyweights that run around fighting who should be number 1, 2, or 3. You should just fight about who was number 1. Now, I know, like me, you grew up, my hero was my dad, but if there had to be an athlete that was my hero, it was probably Muhammad Ali. And when Ali died, I remember this because I wrote an article about Ali the night he died also, and I know you did, it's in the book. Was this as hard to write for you as it was for me? Because I couldn't believe that a Muhammad Ali could possibly die.
Yeah, it was really tough. And actually, it was also very tough to write about Joe Frazier, which is also in the book. And I did not like Joe Frazier when I was a kid because of what he did to Muhammad Ali, March 8th, 1971. Yeah. But it wasn't, I didn't hate him as a person. I just was a Muhammad Ali person who wanted Muhammad Ali to win. But as I grew older,
Joe Frazier was your Green Bay Packers or St. Louis Cardinals.
Exactly, but I don't think I'll ever grow to appreciate them like I did Joe Frazier. Things change with Joe Frazier. Obviously he appeared in Rocky, which was cool, but he just became somebody that I understood, that in a way, I might have misunderstood him a little bit just because of my biased feelings towards Muhammad Ali. So when he died before Muhammad, it was tough. And Muhammad Ali was a Superman to me. And I still find it, Mike, hard to believe that he's not around anymore.
Dude, last night on my way home from the store at midnight, I'm on Spotify listening to, was it Johnny Walken with the Black Superman?
Yeah.
That song still gives me chills. I can hear that song in my head. And I remember the first time I ever heard that song, it was actually on regular radio. And I think the first time I heard it played was the day after Muhammad Ali had beaten Leon Spinks to regain his title in 1978.
Yeah, Muhammad Ali, the Black Superman.
I still remember the day I heard that song. I remember exactly where on the road we were when it came on. And it was my Kennedy assassination moment because I'm not old enough to remember that. But I remember exactly where I was then. And Ali's title defenses from 75 on, I can actually close my eyes and be back in my room in 1977 for that 15th round when he's fighting Ernie Shavers. And my bedtime was like 10 o'clock at night. And the fight was going into like the 9th, 10th round. And my mom makes me go to bed. And then I'm sitting up with my ear to my door so I can hear the TV with my dad watching the fight. And then all of a sudden, as like the 14th or 15th round's getting ready to start, my dad yells, "Go ahead and turn your TV on or come in here because I know you're listening." And I remember I had my tonsils out in 76. And that weekend, I'm at home. The only thing I can do is eat ice cream and soft foods. Ali's fighting Jimmy Young. I remember watching that fight on, I think it was a Saturday night. And I remember every time I saw Muhammad Ali fight, and I can go back to that day and tell you exactly what was going on in my house even.
Yeah, his appeal, I tell people that the young people that they don't understand, because when he fought, the world literally stopped, and people don't really get that. When he fought George Foreman, I was in high school, and we didn't have what we have now. Obviously, we didn't have the internet. It was in Africa. The big time difference. So the results, I wouldn't hear the results until like 1 o'clock in the morning. I had the radio on. I was supposed to go to school the next day, but I was listening to the radio for the results. And I was one of the few people that said that he would win. Now, I might have been wishing that would happen, but I had seen George Foreman train, because he was training over at the Pleasanton Fairgrounds where we practiced basketball, because I was part of a new high school and we didn't have our gym yet. And I was watching him hit that bag and knocking out sparring partners. And in the back of my mind, I was like, holy moly. But I will tell you, when the news flashed that Muhammad Ali had won by an 8th-round stoppage, I jumped out of bed and started screaming at 1 o'clock in the morning, he won! He won! He won! And my dad gets up. My mom, what's going on? I go, Muhammad Ali won. My dad grinned, and my mom's like, go back to bed. God, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't go back to bed. I was so excited and so happy, because it was such an upset. And then I remember thinking, God, first he does it to Sonny Liston, and then he does it to George Foreman. And that was Muhammad Ali. And back to your original question, yes, writing that, it was surreal, because he was so important and so amazing a fighter and a person that I had a hard time with it. I usually can write these things relatively fast, like I know you do. But I had a hard time. It took me hours, because I was really trying to reflect on his impact, not just for me, but for everyone. And that's why I included it, because it got a lot of response. But still, it was one of the hardest ones. I know I had tears in my eyes when I was writing it, because it's part of life. I know all those cliches, but that man, he was more than a shadow over sports world. He was like a country. I mean, he was his own country in a sense. And it's like I said, it's still hard to believe he's not around. I watched him on The Grueling Truth fighting Ernie Shavers and Gilly. We were just showing it. And I was like, God, he's really not around anymore. It's really hard to imagine.
Yeah. I mean, that's an iconic figure. And the thing is, we grew up in a time, 50s, 60s, 70s, where there was more than one or two iconic figures. There aren't any anymore, are there? In anything, any walk of life, I don't think there is.
Not to me. I mean, I maybe somebody 20-something might say there was, but those guys, I think about, like you had my favorite football player. You had the day of Dale Sayers. He to me, he's iconic. He's the greatest football player I ever saw, greatest running back I ever saw. So to me, when I was watching him, he was a god in a sense. I'll never forget, my dad and I were watching the Bears against the Vikings, and he took the kickoff 99 yards, and it was just like, wow, and he was just amazing. And there are athletes out there now that are something, but I think it's just the world has changed so much that with all the information we have, things are so different. I obviously liked it better then as far as that goes, just because it was a smaller world in a way, and we could appreciate these guys. It's the icon. People say Floyd Mayweather was an icon. See, I don't think he's an icon.
No.
There isn't any, but good and all that stuff. But any of the active guys, Canelo is no icon. Lomachenko, as much as I admire his talent, he's not an icon. There isn't anybody like in that class nowadays, at least in my view.
No. Who was the last iconic figure in boxing then?
Well, it certainly wasn't. Tyson. He's not an icon as far as I'm concerned. The last one was, boxing hasn't. See, as far as I'm concerned, Sugar Ray Leonard was an icon for sure. I would put Marvin Hagler in there, right? Marvin Hagler.
Yeah, but Marvin Hagler, by iconic figure to me, everybody knows who he is.
Well, and it's got to be Sugar Ray Leonard, right? Because, the gold medalist, and it's got to be him. Him and the other Sugar, they're both icons. Of course, he was from another time, but nobody now.
Yeah, because I remember growing up in the 70s, we had at least three iconic figures just in sports. You had, well, not in sports, but you had Ali, Elvis Presley, and, of course, Evel Knievel.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved Evil, so yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, you have to count Evel Knievel, because he was iconic. He was on TV all the time back then.
He sure was, and whenever he was jumping on Wild World of Sports, I never missed it. There was one time where my dad and I were not on the same page. He could not stand Evil. I would want to come out in the living room, Mike, and watch Evil. And he go, "I'm not going to watch that con man." And I look at him like, "What?" He go, "I'm not watching him. I'm fine."
Hey, in the end, your dad was right, though. But when you're that young, the con man's cool.
My dad was right on the money. He sure was. And he used to think, oh, God, when he'd stand up on the ramp and he'd be acting like he was going to die any second. Well, he could have.
Well, yeah. But I mean, he missed enough jumps. He could have easily died.
Exactly. And he was iconic. You're right. And there have been a lot after him. But there you go. Nobody has captured the imagination of the public like Evel Knievel. There will only be one Evel Knievel, and that's a really good example of what an icon is.
All right, so as we wrap this up, your final chapter in the book, The Wait, you want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. Now that one I tried to get a little literary. I mean, when I write, I used to write short stories a lot, Mike. I love to write short stories. My dream is to write a novel, and I might be working on that at some point. But that one came out of a true story. So when anybody reads it, they have to know that the setup was true.
I knew the movie. The setup is what you based. I knew it when I didn't even get a chance to read it all, and I got like 3 paragraphs in, and I think, this is John's favorite movie all over again.
Oh no, not the movie. The setup. I'm talking about the setup of how it all.
No, but it reminded me the way you wrote it of the setup. You know, it was kind of gritty. I would have thought, if I didn't know you, that this was written in the 50s when I started writing it or reading it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. That's very, very complimentary. Thank you so much. I love Hard Boiled. I love Raymond Chandler. I love Dashiell Hammett. I love those kind of things. So I was shooting for the gritty. That night was very gritty. And I will tell you this: the reason I will tell people this: the reason it's called The Wait. The reason that it came up for The Wait is because the doctor, who had to be obviously at ringside, was not there. So we were waiting for the doctor. And while we were waiting, this story popped into my head, and there were 2 guys in the ring. And then I just wrote this whole fictionalized story of what happened between these 2 guys. And it's all just the point of view of 2 guys in the ring and their managers, and the young guy and the old guy, and yeah, I've gotten another one. That's another one that never been published. Not very many people have read it, and I actually had a couple of boxers read it, Mike, and I didn't have to pay them or whatever. They said that they really liked it, so said it was pretty realistic. I understood the mentality of the fighters, and I was really touched by that. So I had decided to put it in there just because, let's put it in there, and I've already gotten 3 or 4 comments that people have really liked it. So I feel really good about that.
All right, John, you want to tell us where people can get the book?
Oh, absolutely. You go on Amazon.com and you just put Blood on My Notebook, Dispatches with Blood on My Notebook. You'll see it right in, and then you'll see the other subtitles, Dispatches from the World of Professional Boxing. And you will see it, and you will understand immediately where I got the title, Blood on My Notebook, real fast. It was just because that's exactly what happened. I was at a fight, and as I talk about, and 2 guys were above me, and it was right when I started, and they were going at it. Somebody got hit with a punch, got cut, and this mist of blood just dripped right down, landed on me and my notebook. And I looked at my notebook, and I this is true, because I wrote it down in that notebook. If I ever write a book, it's going to be called Blood on My Notebook. So there it is. That's how it all started, and that was 10 years ago. So that tells you how the dream started, and how now that it's living, of course, is just an amazing experience. Yeah. So you go on Amazon, you get it, you'll see it. Got a 5-star review, which again is just amazing to me, and it's $14.99, 281 pages of just my journey, my personal journey, and I'm just loving every second of it that people are enjoying it. And I know you told me that you enjoyed it, and that really made me feel good, Mike. So thank you for that.
And also, I enjoyed a ringside boxing show you and Dennis Taylor do every Sunday night. You want to tell everybody a little bit about that?
Oh, the ringside boxing show. That's Dennis's dream show, and we've been doing pretty well with our guests. But right now it's been a little harder with the holidays. But we're going to have some surprises up our sleeve for some guests in the future. I think we've got a guy that you know pretty well. Christopher James Shelton's going to come on this weekend and talk a little boxing history. So we like to mix it all up and do that. And the show is a blast to do, obviously, just like you and Jeremiah and John do your show and stuff. And Jeremiah does his thing. It's always so good. And the variety is just so much fun on The Grueling Truth with all these boxing shows. Any boxing lover has just got to love, obviously I'm being redundant here, but you have to love being on The Grueling Truth just because it's representative of you and Jeremiah and me in a sense that we love boxing, and you see it right there. And there you go. But yeah, the Ringside Boxing Show has been on about 10 years now, and I think it's better now than it ever has been, to be honest, Mike. I think Rizwan and Travis, we have a nice variety of guys talking. We don't always agree, I actually like it when we don't agree, because then it's fun. And give people an insider look at boxing and different opinions, and then we always have hopefully a pretty good guest, and go from there. But yeah, it's a blast of a show to do, and it seems like people really like it too, which of course is even better.
All right, guys, I want to remind you, Blood on My Notebook, go to Amazon, buy it. It is a great read. Make sure you get it. Be the perfect present for a boxing fan. We're going to go ahead and we're going to wrap the show up right now. I want to thank John for coming on the show. I want to remind everybody you can follow us on Twitter at Grueling Truth. Go to thegruelingtruth.com. You can find us on every platform that carries podcasts now, including Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher. Wherever you find any kind of podcast, you'll find The Grueling Truth. So for John J.Raspanti, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.